Iraqi forces launch an all-out assault aimed at driving insurgents out of the city of Fallujah near Baghdad. Pro-Russian activists in Ukraine's Donetsk region are putting final touches for Sunday's referendum on independence. And hundreds of Syrians returned to the old city of Homs, celebrating victory over terrorist groups. This is Al-Ittijah World News. I'm Zainab Ali. Iraq's Ministry of Defense announced that a full-scale military operation is underway in the embattled city of Fallujah to root out militants belonging to the Al-Qaeda-linked Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant.
The deafening sound of artillery shells are once again being heard falling on the city of Fallujah, more than a week after the end of the country's parliamentary elections. The Iraqi Defense Ministry announced the launch of the much-delayed military operation to retake the city from militants in the restive Anbar province. So far, 11 militants have been killed and dozens wounded as a result of an army bombardment against extremist fighters' positions. Soldiers numbering in the 40,000 have been deployed along with police officers and pro-government tribal militias to Fallujah, some 48 kilometers east of Baghdad. The Anbar province has been plagued by violence since December, when the army removed an anti-government protest camp in the provincial capital of Ramadi. Authorities said the camp was used as headquarters for the leadership of Al-Qaeda. The bloodshed later spread to the nearby city of Fallujah. Violence in Ramadi has largely been subdued, while Fallujah remains completely out of government control after being overrun in January by militants from the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, an Al-Qaeda offshoot. The army barricaded the city in response and has since been delaying the assault to avoid civilian casualties. Now the full-scale military operation is underway in a bid to quell Al-Qaeda-linked fighters and hostile tribesmen, whose resurgence has killed hundreds of civilians, forced nearly 400,000 people to flee their homes, and inflicted severe damage on infrastructure.
Earlier, my colleague Mariam Ghaddar spoke to Mr. Hussein Shaloushi, a political analyst, who said that this military operation in Fallujah is a step forward in fighting extremist groups in Iraq.
The strategic ISIL takeover of Fallujah forced the Iraqi army to move in a very slow pace towards Fallujah. ISIL was able to take over the main highway in the city, meaning that government forces were left with no option but to surround the city and move cautiously into their stronghold. Therefore, the army was forced to deploy in the surroundings of Fallujah and slowly move in without inflicting major losses within their ranks. Now the most significant and strategic area for both the Iraqi army and ISIL is Western Fallujah. Western Fallujah is considered as the main gateway to Baghdad and central Iraq. If this group is able to take over central Iraq, God forbid, then it would be easier for them to supply and assist their comrades in other areas, and ultimately take control of the main highway linking Baghdad to Karbala and Hilla. According to security sources, it has become very clear that ISIL and other Al-Qaeda affiliated groups are using Fallujah and Anbar province as a starting point for their military operations against civilians. Car bombs and explosives are equipped in that area. Therefore, as you can see, when the Iraqi army began this major operation and surrounded these areas, Baghdad became safer. Less car bombs are going off now. This is due to the siege the army has imposed on Fallujah and Anbar. Baghdad's security is highly dependent on securing those areas. Also, I would like to say that many cars equipped with explosives are being sent from neighboring countries, such as Saudi Arabia, Jordan and Syria. So if the Iraqi army is able to encircle Fallujah and stop ISIL militants from leaving their stronghold, the security situation in Baghdad will become calm. Resistance groups such as Hezbollah brigades and Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq were founded to fight occupation forces. Now the US forces have withdrawn, and the Iraqi army along with the security forces are in charge of implementing security in the country. However, if resistance groups are asked by the Iraqi army to assist, they will not think twice to provide assistance, because their goal is to see a safe Iraq free of violence, free of terrorism. Now the Iraqi army is doing a good job in eliminating Al-Qaeda in Iraq. When the resistance is asked to help, it will, because it is part of the Iraqi community. The resistance supports the Iraqi army in all its military operations. The resistance held many demonstrations and festivals in Baghdad to voice their unlimited and endless support for the army. And as I said before, when they are asked to assist, they will not think twice to give their blood for the sake of Iraq. Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki until now was able to win the most seats in parliament after the free elections in Iraq on April 30th. Whether Maliki wins a third term or not, it is his obligation and duty to defend Iraq and continue this military operation against ISIL. I must admit that such military operations did go in his advantage in the elections, because the people who voted in his favor witnessed the achievements made on the ground. The people of Iraq want security, and Maliki was able to some extent provide such security, and it went to his advantage in the parliamentary elections. Whether Maliki wins a third term or not, he or anyone else must not stop the military operations against Al-Qaeda, because the people of Iraq want to live a stable life, free of violence.
At least 18 people have been killed after a series of deadly attacks across Iraq. A suicide bomber detonated his vehicle at a checkpoint in the town of Tarmiya, north of Baghdad. The resulting blast killed at least 8 soldiers and 4 civilians and wounded at least 20. While in the northern city of Tikrit, a roadside bomb exploded, killing 2 police officers and 1 civilian. Another bomb targeted pro-government Al-Sahwa militia, killed 3 and wounded 2 others. Meanwhile, separate shootings in the northern province of Nineveh killed 2 people. The 2 eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk in Ukraine are putting the finishing touches on preparations for their referendums on self-rule, scheduled for May 11th. Now, the vote could pave the way for the creation of an independent People's Republic that many see as a prelude to joining the Russian Federation, and in doing so, following in Crimea's footsteps.
It's not a typical election headquarters, but behind the barbed wire, organisers of Sunday's separatist referendum in East Ukraine's Donetsk region are hard at work. The ballot boxes will be taken to polling stations, or even carried door to people's homes for the region's 3 million voters. Kiev rejects the vote as illegitimate, with opponents calling it a farce. But at this polling station at least, officials are confident.
We think that everything is ready. We don't have the ballot boxes in place yet, but we are having meetings to prepare and all the materials are ready. The entire team is already here, so that means I wouldn't say we're not ready. In fact, it's the opposite. We're ready.
Like other rebel leaders, the self-proclaimed mayor of the flashpoint city of Slavyansk vowed to push ahead with the vote. That came despite a surprise call from Russian President Vladimir Putin for a postponement.
The immense majority of the people of the city will vote positively. I'm drawing such conclusions because I talk to residents, to a lot of people. They all support us, those who want a better future. That's why I think that everything will go well here in our hometown.
The loudest voices on the street are pro-Russian and anti-Kiev, out in force on Friday during celebrations for victory over the Nazis in World War II. At Donetsk's regional administrative building, one of many to have been taken by the pro-Russians, the message is clear. Being outspoken in favour of a united Ukraine is not easy, and this priest says pro-Ukrainians like him won't be taking part in the ballot.
We're saying it's illegal and illegitimate. And on the other side, it doesn't make sense to talk about Donetsk region splitting with the rest of Ukraine and becoming an independent republic. We want to stay in a united Ukraine and to be Ukrainian citizens.
The question on the ballot paper asks, do you support the declaration of independence of the Donetsk People's Republic? The answer to the question over the future of this region and Ukraine as a whole is much harder to predict.
In a joint statement with French President François Hollande and German Chancellor Angela Merkel, said Paris and Berlin are willing to draw appropriate consequences if the scheduled May 25th Ukrainian presidential elections do not go ahead as planned.
We consider the referendum scheduled for tomorrow illegitimate and focus on the election on May 25th in the entire Ukraine. If that internationally recognized presidential election is not happening, that would lead unavoidably to a further destabilization of the country. And then the measure adopted by the European Council comes into play, that we are ready to take further sanctions against Russia. But this measure does not serve our own purposes. What we want is to further the political process over the next fortnight.
Well, tensions were running high on the eve of an independence referendum that is scheduled to take place in the eastern Ukrainian cities of both Donetsk and Luhansk on May 11, which the West has already described as illegal.
While preparations were in full swing for the disputed vote in the two cities of Donetsk and Luhansk, tensions were running at fever pitch in Ukraine's eastern region. The southeastern city of Mariupol was mourning the loss of more than 21 activists, with pro-Russian supporters unable to hide their anger. Residents blocked the streets with barricades of tires, garbage containers and chairs with no sign of Ukrainian forces. Meanwhile, others set alight a captured Ukrainian army armored vehicle, causing the ammunition inside to explode. Early Saturday, pro-Russia separatists released 9 Red Cross staff after briefly detaining them on Friday on suspicions of espionage. The brief detention of Red Cross members underscored jitters in the two regions of eastern Ukraine. This as the atmosphere in major cities across the east was tense one day before the May 11th referendum. For now, the vote to take place in Luhansk and Donetsk could have serious consequences for Ukraine and relations between Moscow, with many in the West describing the vote as illegitimate.
And to get some more analysis on this, we have political analyst Mr. William Spring joining us. Mr. Spring, good to have you with us today. So with this referendum set to take place tomorrow in Donetsk and Luhansk, are we likely to see the situation in Ukraine spiral further out of control?
Well, I think the situation in Ukraine was and became out of control the moment the West decided to back the undemocratic movement in the Maidan, which sought to nullify perfectly legitimate elections that Mr. Yanukovych had. And there was another election due next year. Now, by this signal, the EU and America signaled that they really have a complete and total contempt for democracy. For them, only it's the rabble or the mob that they can finance who are the real power. Now, this is a very serious constitutional aberration. And I think these moves in the eastern provinces are minimal. They're there to give an indication of people's feelings. But it's extremely difficult to assert your constitutional rights when the government is doing its best, or the junta that rules in Kiev is doing its best to assassinate peaceful civilians, which is what is happening. They have absolutely no right whatsoever to take to the streets with a band of thugs from the right sector. And when the Ukrainian army won't open fire on civilians, get the right sector to do it. This is what Hitler did. He had a paramilitary group who we called the SS, who worked in parallel with the German army. And when the German army didn't want to do certain things, Hitler ordered the SS to do it. And that is what is happening now in east of Ukraine.
Now, in terms of the disagreements over the Ukrainian crisis, some are saying that this is a restart of the Cold War. Would you agree with that?
Well, it's a restart of the Cold War only in the sense that the West has restarted the Cold War. Prior to the revolution, so-called, whereby Yanukovych was thrown out of town, the situation was relatively peaceful. Then there were these elections and demonstrations, rather, in the Maidan against the failure of Yanukovych to initial or to endorse an EU arrangement. This was an agreement well within his competence to refuse to do. Now, consequently, this is a new Cold War which has been begun by the West. It's been begun by Catherine Ashton. It's been begun by William Hague, Victoria Nuland, and John Kerry. These are the real culprits for the breakdown of the relationship, not only between Russia and the West, but between all people of goodwill and the West. The West is regarded as some sort of demonic alliance, which is no longer considering the interests of its citizens that it was supposed to protect originally. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was there to protect the citizens of Western Europe, not engage in rampages all over the world, including now Ukraine, which by all logical methods should be neutralized. I think Russia would back off if Kerry and these people in Washington agreed to the most reasonable demands of Russia, that Ukraine would be neutralized, that no NATO forces should be based in the Ukraine. If that was agreed, if that simple statement was endorsed by Mr. Kerry, the so-called crisis would disappear immediately. Of course, the dead won't come back. The numerous people that NATO have killed in the Ukraine, they can't be resurrected, but at least the crisis could be assuaged. As things are, Mr. Kerry and co are heading very straight down a one-way street towards what may be a very serious war.
Yeah, so the U.S. State Department clearly still doesn't think that Russia is doing enough. What else do they expect Moscow to do?
Well, I don't know what they expect Moscow to do. What we expect is the State Department reorganizes itself. It seems there was a time, in my lifetime anyway, when the State Department and the British Ministry of Foreign Affairs were relatively professional organisations. Now, in the case of the UK Ministry, that may still be true in the case of the civil servants, not in the case of the Minister, Mr. Hague. But the US State Department has been taken over by a whole bunch of ex-military. And these people have no comprehension of foreign affairs, really. Their whole object is to get the other guy, a sort of American macho culture, which doesn't play very well on the international stage when you've got thousands of nuclear weapons, any one of which could go off at any moment. And in particular, one or two of them might land on Detroit or on Washington or somewhere like that. And then how would President Obama react? Okay, they can say, well, we flattened the other side, but that's not going to be great for the world peace. We might as well just put up the shutters, because the way they are going in Washington is to create a new world war. That world war, if it happens, which I sincerely hope it doesn't, will be a nuclear war. And both sides, both Russia and the United States, have major stockpiles of weaponry. Now, I call on Mr. Hague. What does he think he's doing, encouraging these rascals in Kiev, and that's the only word I can describe them, encouraging these Hitlerite thugs in Kiev to launch a new world war or to trigger one? That's what happened in Sarajevo almost 100 years ago. This time, though, the British are tied up with the Black Hand gang, and the Americans, they are seeking to create a new world war.
And what about these Western sanctions imposed on Russia? Do you think it's an effective measure in terms of resolving this conflict?
No, of course not. There's no way that sanctions can resolve a conflict. What can resolve a conflict is diplomacy. And diplomacy needs to be operated by professionals. There is no sign that the US State Department is staffed by professional diplomats. The Russian Foreign Affairs Ministry is staffed by professional diplomats, and some of the European chancelleries are staffed by professional diplomats. But Catherine Ashton is manifestly not a professional diplomat. The EU has no professional foreign policy. Now, if we could get back to a situation where diplomats were running the show and showing the way forward, it would be a better situation than allowing the American military-industrial complex, who have now occupied Washington through their lobby groups and so on, to take things over. Remember, we're at the end of 50 years or so, or 70 years of the end of the war. Now, in two wars in this century, last century, Britain and America and Russia were allied together. Now, why on earth is Mr. Haig seeking to create a third world war against an ally of ours? We used to be allies, Russia and Britain. In fact, it's only due to the heroism of the citizens at Stalingrad and places like that that I'm not speaking German, because I was brought up immediately after the Second World War. And of course, our own boys. I don't discount the contribution made by Britain and by the Americans. But we were allies together. Mr. Haig and Mr. Kerry are doing all in their power to break up what was a reset in the terms of the Russian-American relationship. We were told this was going to be a new world where everything would be sorted out amicably. But in fact, the Americans have just gone back to their old bully boy tactics and backing up the Bandera thugs. You see, we didn't rely on Ukraine to win the war for us. There were many brave Ukrainians in World War II, but many Ukrainians were on the side of the Nazis. And I don't think that it will ever be forgotten. And for Mr. Haig to try and put us into a world war in order to support a fascist junta in Kiev is deplorable. I hope he will look at his history books and think again.
Okay, so do you think that the US and the EU will make any concessions of their own now to try and help resolve the crisis diplomatically?
They will have to make some concessions because, for example, the EU has just done a secret report, or not so secret, on the effect of sanctions, and have pointed out that the most terrible effect would be on the German economy. And Germany has a great deal of interest in de-escalating the crisis economically. Of course, the United States has not so much trade with Russia, but the European Union has a very substantial trade with Russia, and in particular Germany. So let us hope common sense in some way prevails to bring this situation back under control. Although I don't think the state of Ukraine can be recovered. I think it will just have to be reorganized, but giving autonomy in the East. If they don't give that autonomy, if they don't neutralize Ukraine, then I think you will see the East breaking up and maybe a civil war and a serious disturbance for many years to come.
Is it possible to hold presidential polls at this moment in Ukraine?
No, well, I don't think there are any presidential polls held now are illegitimate anyway, because there was a president, Yanukovych. He was thrown out of office, not by the actions of the electorate, but by the actions of a mob who suborned the deputies in the Reichstag, I was going to say, but it's actually in the Rada, I think the right word for it is. And this was not a democratic process whereby Yanukovych was forced to flee the country. Hundreds of people were killed in this shooting, all of which was put down to Yanukovych. But we do know that there were Secret Service forces of the United States of America operating in Kiev on those tragic days. And they're still operating down in the east of the country. They've got Blackwater operators there. And many of the people who are being shot down in, not Gdansk, I was going to say, but down in the Donetsk, many of those people are being shot by Blackwater mercenaries. They're not being shot even by the Ukrainian army.
So why does the West believe that the interim leaders in Kiev should get this popular support?
well, the interim leaders in Kiev are not going to give support for any solution which is going to be democratic, rational, and sensible, because the leaders in Kiev are really off their heads, many of them. Some of them are really serious relics from the Second World War and would be better off in the mountains chasing wolves. These people are not rational people in Kiev. They have to be told what to do by their sponsors. The United States is their sponsor. If the United States told the rebels, or not the rebels, they are the rebels, the real rebels, but if the US told the Kiev junta how to behave, gave them a few lessons in how to win friends and influence people, they might behave better. But what they're doing is they've alienated the Kiev junta in the short time in so-called office, have alienated not only the people of the East, but all people of civilized mind throughout the world, because you cannot send tanks and armed thugs dressed up as the National Guard, but who in fact are Blackwater employees or from the right sector. You cannot send those sort of people down to kill civilians, which we have all seen on our television screens, through RT, through the BBC, but not so far, I have to say, through Sky News. Sky News hasn't even got a mention on its news wall of the events that are going on at the moment. It's an appalling news organisation, and I really hope that the Sky News journalists will rebel against the decisions being made for them not to report on what's going on in the east of Ukraine. Because everybody now knows what the junta is capable of. They know that they are no better than the South African police who shot down 100 or so unarmed people at Sharpeville. These are the same mentality of the junta in Kiev. And I can only hope and pray that somebody in Kiev actually thinks, oh, one day I've got to face God. You know, they are responsible for the deaths of so many civilians, for the complete destruction of their country. Kiev was a pleasant place to live at one time last year, up till about October. And then now it's turned into hell. Nobody can even hold a victory parade there. Because how can you do a victory parade when you've got the main square trashed by these thugs? And so something needs to be done to rebuild what's left of the shattered state of Ukraine.
Okay, Mr. Spring, we're going to leave it there. Political analyst there, Mr. William Spring, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, do stay with us here on Al-Ittijah World News. Still to come. China unveils the first capital market guideline. Welcome back. Here's a reminder of our top stories. Iraqi forces launch an all-out assault aimed at driving insurgents out of the city of Fallujah near Baghdad. Pro-Russian activists in Ukraine's Donetsk region are putting final touches for Sunday's referendum on independence. And hundreds of Syrians return to the old city of Homs, celebrating victory over terrorist groups. Thousands of Syrians have begun returning to their homes for a second day after the pullout of the last militant groups from the old city of Homs. And despite scenes of mass destruction, residents are determined to rebuild their homes and lives.
Returning home is what the people of Syria's old city of Homs have been eagerly awaiting for more than 2 years. And now, after clearing the city from the last batch of militants, the wait finally came to an end. With what they could handle of belongings, thousands of Homs residents continued to flock to their hometown for a second straight day. The process was facilitated by the Syrian army, which now controls the whole area. Being home again, however, came with a mix of joy and melancholy, as many residents came home to damaged properties and infrastructure after months-long shelling by militants. However, the scale of devastation has not deterred locals, who have vowed to rebuild their lives.
I couldn't enter my home through the door. I entered through a hole in the wall. Everything surrounding the house is damaged. The house only had columns.
I hope the international community comes to see the destruction they left here. People worked hard for years to build their city, and those militants came and ruined it all.
The liberation of the old city of Homs has represented a boost for Syrians across the country, as they too are hoping that similar achievements can be made in each city where foreign-backed Takfiri groups have wreaked havoc in the crisis-ridden nation.
Now, Syria's Supreme Constitutional Court has announced the names of the final 3 presidential candidates participating in the country's presidential election, slated for June 3rd. Politicians Maher Abdul Hafiz al-Hajjar, Hassan al-Nouri, and incumbent Syrian President Bashar al-Assad are 3 of the 24 nominees who applied for the candidacy.
This announcement is a notification to the candidates to start their election campaign, starting from Sunday, May 11, 2014. The Supreme Constitutional Court is announcing the final list of candidates for the post of President of the Republic. According to their request, they are Maher Abdul Hafiz Hajjar, Hassan Abdullah al-Nouri, and Bashar Hafiz al-Assad.
Hassan Abdullah al-Nouri, Bashar Hafiz al-Assad.
Following 5 months of bloodshed, South Sudanese President Salva Kiir and former Vice President Riek Machar signed a peace deal in the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa, vowing to end the deadly fighting in the world's youngest nation.
It took thousands of lives and a whole lot of bloodshed for the warring sides in South Sudan to finally sign a peace agreement. Although it may be inked with the blood of the victims of intense and savage fighting between government troops and insurgents, the deal nonetheless marks a historic moment for the 3-year-old nation.
Let's welcome the leaders.
In their first face-to-face meeting since the atrocities began, South Sudanese President Salva Kiir and former Vice President Riek Machar signed a peace deal late on Friday, which stipulates that a truce be implemented and that a transitional government be formed ahead of the country's elections.
Now that we have signed this document under the auspices of the IGAD, I want to assure you that I and my part, the party I am leading, and the army that I'm leading, will implement this agreement without any fail.
By me signing today this agreement, I am sending the signal But this conflict must be ended peacefully. I hope the other side will also be serious on this matter.
Khartoum, for its part, was quick to welcome the peace deal and said it supports the truce as Sudan was one of the neighboring African states to accommodate hundreds of thousands of South Sudanese refugees. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, who has threatened to impose sanctions if the two sides fail to stop the violence, reacted by saying that the ceasefire, due to take effect on Saturday, could mark a breakthrough for the future of South Sudan. The hard journey on a long road begins now, and the work must continue. The journey of 1,000 miles, it seems, did begin with a single step, but that single step won't take them to the finish line. That is, unless both sides abide by the agreement. Meanwhile, the United Nations Food Agency warned of the high risks of famine in South Sudan due to the conflict. The humanitarian group appealed for access to deliver urgent aid supplies to civilians. Now South Sudanese civilians will have to wait and see if the two sides will abide by the accord to the end or repeat a January scenario when it took only days for a ceasefire to collapse.
4 protesters were killed and 20 others wounded in Libya's Benghazi when gunfire erupted at a demonstration outside a militia base in the eastern city. The demonstration comes one day after gunmen killed the head of the country's intelligence for eastern Libya, Colonel Ibrahim el-Sanusi. Benghazi was the cradle of the 2011 uprising that ended Muammar Gaddafi's 4-decade rule and has since been plagued by violence that has killed dozens of members of the security forces, judges, and foreigners. In a new effort to continue its economic growth, China has announced the guiding principles of regulations for the capital market in coming years. The first guideline envisions a multi-tier market by 2020 with a proper structure, functions, and regulations, high efficiency and inclusiveness in one of the world's largest economies. Troops from the U.S. and the Philippines have engaged in live fire and air power demonstrations on the 6th day of joint military exercises. The 10-day annual military drills are part of a new security pact between the two countries, focusing on maritime security in the face of China's growing naval presence in the disputed South China Sea amid increasing tensions. A North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, and his wife observed a combat flight contest at an Air Force base in the western region of the country. The report on the engine testing comes a week after reports of heightened activities at Pyongyang's nuclear test site, indicating it was ready to conduct a 4th nuclear test. North Korea is believed to be developing a nuclear weapon and the technology to miniaturize a warhead to mount it on a long-range missile. Southeast Asia's regional bloc voiced alarm on Saturday over escalating tensions in the South China Sea after members of Vietnam and Philippines squared off against Beijing in the disputed waters. Association of Southeast Asian Nations foreign ministers expressed serious concerns over the ongoing developments in the South China Sea, which is subject to a web of bitter overlapping claims on the eve of a leaders' summit in the Burmese capital. Supporters of Thailand's beleaguered government gathered on Saturday on the outskirts of the capital Bangkok, determined to safeguard democracy and avert a coup, as anti-government protesters based at a central park planned their final push to topple the caretaker cabinet.
The streets of the Thai capital Bangkok are filled with tension once again. On the one hand, the red shirts of government sympathizers are burnished in the western parts of the city, while on the other hand, opposition supporters are gathering to press on with their demands. With the presence of the two camps, fears are mounting that the country may be descending into civil violence. Supporters of the People's Democratic Reform Committee kicked off what they have dubbed as the final battle. The opposition is determined that the caretaker government should resign within 3 days.
People feel uncomfortable and we want the government to get out so we can have a new administration.
Government supporters, meanwhile, are fusing a bid to install an unelected regime following the ousting of Yingluck Shinawatra. They want the fate of the government to be decided at the polls.
It can be negotiated to end conflict. Any conflict in the world ended with negotiation. But our red shirts gathering this time and standing firm on the election. If the opposition wants to reform, it must reform in parliament. We will not accept reforms through people on the streets.
With pro- and anti-government protesters converging in the capital, many fear that a showdown may be looming as the country appears to be plunging deeper into political turmoil.
Lebanon is bracing for a summer drought after a record dry winter worsened by a massive influx of Syrian refugees and long-standing water management problems.
For farmers here in the Bekaa Valley, these are worrying times. With very little winter snow and rain, Lebanon is facing its worst drought in 80 years.
Due to the lack of rain in Lebanon this year, the crop production has dropped to 50%, and we're afraid that we will go dry this year.
This year's rainfall was half normal levels. As a result, the riverbeds and wells used to irrigate crops may fall to dangerously low levels. And finding more water is no easy task.
Le Liban, ça fait plus de 50 ans.
For 50 years, Lebanon has been pumping the groundwater table, and it's recently experienced a significant drawdown. Before, we could find water at 20 meters, and now we have to dig wells down to 200 meters to pump water for the farmers and supply our cities.
Pour les agriculteurs et pour alimenter aussi les villes libanaises.
Water cuts in the capital are now frequent. Yet many Lebanese haven't modified wasteful habits, like washing their cars as much as 3 times a week. The company Just Wash is trying to satisfy demand without depleting Lebanon's valuable water supplies.
We wash a car with less than a cup of water, around 100 to 150 millimeters compared to other stations that use an average of 150 liters of water. We're campaigning against water waste in Lebanon because we're getting to a point where we won't have any water anymore.
But more drastic measures may be needed. More than 1 million Syrian refugees now live in Lebanon, increasing the country's overall population 20% and placing further pressure on its limited resources.
New Caledonia will face a looming independence vote fraught with uncertainty, with the nickel-rich Pacific territory having to decide whether to stick with colonial power France or strike out on its own.
In the South Pacific, a very French scene in New Caledonia's capital. But it's the relationship of this overseas territory to France which is up for debate. The islands are racing towards a referendum on independence due in the next 4 years. In parts of the country where the indigenous Kanak Melanesians are a majority, like the North, many believe it's time for New Caledonia to stand on its own.
Independence for everyone, so that we can build together, and everyone has responsibilities.
They're buoyed on by the presence of nickel. The territory boasts a quarter of all known deposits.
Et nous avons évidemment un potentiel.
We obviously have the potential here, notably in resources, in terms of the sea, in terms of services, in terms of tourism, in terms of other important sectors, even agriculture, which means we have the possibility to manage this.
A 1998 agreement set down the framework for a referendum after almost 70 people were killed in political violence in the 80s. The United Nations has New Caledonia on its list of territories to be decolonised, but pro-France parties dominate the Congress. They say independence would leave the economy in tatters, with 15% of GDP in the form of transfers from France.
If France had to leave, the standard of living for Caledonian people would drop. All of the social services we have here, which don't exist anywhere in the Pacific, wouldn't be here.
But wealth is not evenly spread. Kanaks are the largest ethnic group and are often hit hardest by the high cost of living. Disputes over whether the vote itself will be free and fair continue to divide the pro- and anti-independence lobbies. And recently, the president has called to replace the very accord which agreed that a referendum must be held. This could mean avoiding the vote, but obtaining more autonomy for the territory without completely cutting ties.
In fact, the main question is, do you agree that a new accord should be negotiated by everybody?
Under the current terms, if politicians fail to set a referendum date before 2018, Paris must do it. But it will be New Caledonians who ultimately decide whether to call it a day with France, shaping the lives of the next generation.
And now here's a look back at our top stories. Iraqi forces launch an all-out assault aimed at driving insurgents out of the city of Fallujah near Baghdad. Pro-Russian activists in Ukraine's Donetsk region are putting final touches for Sunday's referendum on independence. And hundreds of Syrians returned to the old city of Homs, celebrating victory over terrorist groups.